It is estimated that the realm's revenues at the end of the reign of King Ladislav V could only cover 1/3 or 1/4 of Matthias's yearly expenses. They were dominated by the costs of the Black Army, which along with additional defense expenditures made up well over 3/4 of Matthias's expenses. And if the Black Army was not paid, things could turn nasty. The rest of the money was spent on administration, reforms, diplomacy, Matthias's book collection, and cultural and educational endeavors, etc. The realm was not in a good economic position to cover all those expenses. It suffered from a severe lack of developed urban areas, those densely populated concentrations of economically active people selling, buying, trading, producing, consuming, banking, etc. The growing cities were the economic engines of Italy, France, England, Burgundy, Austria, Bohemia, not forgetting the many populous and ancient cities under the Ottoman Sultan. While in the realm of St. Stephen, the cities were too few and too small. Their development was stunted because of the last few decades of feudal dominance, and many emerging urban areas close to the border also failed to develop because of Ottoman raids. Not to mention the fact that the lucrative Dalmatian communes on the Adriatic coast were lost to Venice decades ago. The realm's agricultural base was also suffering the effects of the civil wars, feudal anarchy, and Ottoman raids. Peasants were fleeing economically unviable and devastated areas. A lot of them went into service of larger landholders that could afford to give them better deals and working conditions and ensure their protection. But because peasants were fleeing, landholders, great and small, started finding ways to tie peasants to the land for longer, if not forever, thus turning them into serfs. The lack of urban areas also didn't give peasants avenues for escaping serfdom. Some small landholders of the minor nobility were also struggling as their lands were cut up through inheritance. If those lands suffered devastations or if the peasants left, minor nobles were left with few options. If their land could sustain them, they suffered the indignity to their rank and worked the land on their own, retaining their rank, what was left of their status, and their privileges, giving them advantages over the actual peasants. But if their land could not sustain them, they were forced to sell, and by selling, lose their noble rank and status. After selling, they often joined the peasantry on the new owner's land. It cost them everything, but it kept them alive. These emerging problems were noticed even during János Hunyadi's regency in the 1450s, and both him and later King Matthias issued guarantees of rights to protect the free peasants. Matthias also provided an avenue of escape to struggling nobles through salaried service at court, with the potential of gaining new land. But the struggling peasants and nobles still faced problems from their local administration and judiciary, which was still influenced by landholders that had every interest in seeing their neighbours unlanded, and the peasants tied to the land for longer. The economic problems caused the lack of funds, and Matthias decided to slowly give up on salaried officials and return to a land and landed position for service model, especially for senior officials who then became landed aristocrats and clergy and were no longer beholden to the king. And to add insult to injury, the realm was also suffering a trade deficit, mostly to the benefit of Vienna and Frederick III, who dominated trade down the Danube. To solve his economic problems, Matthias reformed the treasury. From the beginning of his reign, he employed new educated and loyal salaried officials from the ranks of the minor nobility, townsmen, and even a few talented free peasants. One of the most talented treasury officials was a Viennese Jewish convert, János Ernust. He began his service at the treasury in 1459 and quickly rose through the ranks. He became Matthias's main financial reformer, was knighted, ennobled, and became the royal treasurer during a wave of financial reforms in 1467. Matthias filled the treasury through the already mentioned extraordinary taxes, which were so rare and extraordinary that Matthias only levied them once or twice a year. In his 32 years on the throne, Matthias levied around 40 extraordinary taxes. They were of course all approved by the Diet, retroactively or otherwise, after Matthias promised never to levy them again. The extraordinary taxes and new ordinary taxes were collected via new methods implemented in 1467. Instead of collecting taxes on individual parcels of land, they were now collected from the individual households on the parcels of land. Treasury officials also began conducting audits and found that a few of the noble tax collectors had been under-reporting taxes and putting a few coins aside. The Treasury also found ways to circumvent or effectively revoke legal exemptions to taxes, tolls, and customs duties enjoyed by the clergy and the nobility, who of course felt that all of this violated their rights as guaranteed in the Bull of 1222. Matthias also angered the estates in another instance when, in exchange for their approval of new taxes, he freed the estates from some of their military obligations to the crown, but then revoked the subsidy they received from the crown for the military service they no longer performed. The crown also relied on the income from the sizable Hunyadi family estates, which Matthias sought to expand. For this he made use of the provision from the 1351 decree that said that the crown inherits the land of extinct noble families, and he found legal ways to clip the distant branches of family trees in order to direct the inheritance towards the crown. Matthias was putting in a lot more effort into acquiring money than his neighbors were, while the Sultan was making a lot more money with even less effort. The treasury looked for new sources of income, pulled teeth and searched under every cushion to provide Matthias with as much money as possible. But that effort was exhausting Matthias's reputation, his legitimacy, and the realm's economy. The financial policies, the perceived violations of constitutional rights that the king promised to uphold, along with the king's reliance on the very costly Black Army, began to cause discontent among the estates in the Diet. In response, Matthias abused his power to dissolve and summon the Diet, shortening the sessions and extending the gap between them, breaking his promise to summon the Diet on a consistent yearly basis. The violations, the broken promises, and the blatant abuse of power made even Matthias's closest advisors fear that their king was turning into a tyrant. It is ironic that Matthias's efforts to secure his realm and his rule were eating away at both his political and economic foundations. But people were not blind to this at the time. Preparations were being made by Matthias to solve his economic and political woes through military means, controversially not aimed at the Sultan. But first, Matthias's financial reforms of 1467 caused a revolt to break out in Transylvania, which was also suffering from growing divisive economic and political disparity within its own estates.